The approach to the trilithium synthesis facility required 3 hours of painstaking movement through industrial wreckage and abandoned colonial infrastructure. Malaysia used every shadow, every piece of cover, every distraction provided by the constant stream of Goblin transport vehicles to move closer to her target. The facility itself was even more impressive and intimidating, up close. The central spire rose nearly a kilometer into the morning sky, its surface covered with a network of conduits, sensor arrays, and what appeared to be massive particle accelerator rings. Energy discharges crawled along its length like artificial lightning, and the air around it hummed with barely contained power. From her position in the ruins of what had once been the Colonial Administration building, Malaysia could see the main entrance to the facility, a massive archway guarded by automated defense turrets, and a checkpoint manned by heavily armed Goblin troops. Getting through the front door was clearly not an option. But like all industrial installations, the facility required infrastructure, power conduits, waste disposal systems, maintenance access points. And infrastructure always had vulnerabilities. Through her enhanced optics, she identified a thermal exhaust vent approximately 50 meters up the facility's eastern face. The vent was large enough for a human to crawl through, and its heat output would mask her thermal signature from Goblin sensors. The only problem was reaching it. The facility's walls were smooth and vertical, offering few handholds for climbing. But the alien architecture included decorative elements, geometric patterns and structural supports that might provide just enough purchase for someone with the right equipment and sufficient desperation. Malaysia waited until the next shift change created a brief gap in the patrol schedule, then activated her suit's gecko grip system and began the terrifying ascent. The molecular adhesion fields in her gloves and boots allowed her to cling to surfaces that would otherwise be impossible to climb, but the technology was energy-intensive and unreliable at the best of times. Halfway up the wall, her grip failed. For a heart-stopping moment, she fell through space, her hands scrambling for any purchase on the smooth alien metal. Her right boot found a narrow ledge, and she pressed herself against the wall, breathing hard and trying to calm her racing pulse. Below her, a Goblin patrol passed directly underneath, their neural chatter filtering through her interface as casual conversation about duty schedules and equipment maintenance. If they had looked up, they would have seen her silhouetted against the facility's glowing conduits. She completed the climb more carefully, testing each grip before committing her weight to it. The thermal exhaust vent was exactly where she had anticipated, a rectangular opening in the facility's hull protected by a simple mesh screen. The metal was hot enough to leave burns even through her insulated gloves, but the mesh yielded to her cutting tools. The ventilation shaft beyond was a claustrophobic tunnel barely large enough for her to crawl through. Worse, it was filled with superheated air that made breathing difficult and threatened to overwhelm her suit's cooling systems. But it led deeper into the facility, toward the secrets that might determine the fate of the Empire. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes of crawling through the sweltering darkness, Malaysia reached a junction where the ventilation shaft intersected with a larger maintenance corridor. The junction was protected by another mesh screen, but this one opened onto what appeared to be a service area filled with pipes, conduits, and mechanical equipment. She cut through the screen and dropped silently into the corridor, immediately pressing herself against the nearest bulkhead and activating her suit's passive sensors. The neural interface was alive with Goblin communications now, dozens of voices coordinating the facility's operations with the mechanical precision of a hive mind. The corridor stretched in both directions, lit by the pulsing bioluminescence that seemed to be the Goblin equivalent of emergency lighting. Through her interface, she could sense alien workers moving through the facility's main passages, but this service area appeared to be automated. Malaysia consulted her mental map of the facility, trying to orient herself relative to the central spire. According to the intelligence briefing, the trilithium synthesis equipment would be located at the facility's core, probably deep underground where it would be protected from both attack and detection. She chose the corridor branch that led toward the center of the complex and began moving carefully through the alien architecture. The Goblin aesthetic was unlike anything in Imperial space, all sharp angles and geometric patterns that seemed to follow mathematical principles rather than artistic ones. The walls were covered with conduits that pulsed with data streams, and the air hummed with energy discharges from unknown machinery. Every few meters, she encountered monitoring stations, automated sensors that swept the corridors with invisible beams of detection equipment. Her stealth suit could fool most sensors, but she couldn't be certain about alien technology operating on unknown principles. She moved from shadow to shadow, timing her movements to avoid the sensor sweeps. The corridor opened into a larger chamber filled with what appeared to be computer terminals, bank after bank of processing equipment that flickered with data displays showing symbols she couldn't read. But the neural interface provided emotional context, satisfaction, concentration, anticipation. Whatever was happening here, the goblins were pleased with the results. At the center of the chamber stood a holographic display showing a three-dimensional map of the galaxy. Red symbols marked what were clearly goblin-controlled systems, while blue indicators showed Imperial territory. But what caught Milesia's attention were the yellow symbols, neutral or unaligned systems that formed a strategic corridor between Goblin and Imperial space. The implications were staggering. The display showed not just the current state of the conflict but what appeared to be projected expansion routes that would give the Goblins control of nearly a third of known space. And at the center of their strategic planning was the Kepler system, the keystone that would allow them to split Imperial territory in half. Milesia activated her suit's recording systems and documented everything she could see, but she knew the real intelligence lay deeper in the facility. This was planning and coordination, valuable, but not the critical technical information that Admiral Zhao needed. She found a maintenance hatch that led to a lower level and began descending through the facility's mechanical systems. The architecture here was more utilitarian, service corridors and equipment bays that hummed with the constant activity of automated systems. The air grew warmer as she descended, and her radiation detectors began picking up low-level emissions from unknown sources. At the third sublevel, the character of the facility changed dramatically. The corridors were wider and more heavily shielded, with blast doors at regular intervals and what appeared to be emergency containment systems built into the walls. This was clearly where the serious work was being done. Through her neural interface, she could sense increased security in this section, not just automated systems, but actual goblin guards moving through the corridors in coordinated patrols. Their emotional state was different here too, more alert, more focused, with undertones of both excitement and concern that suggested they were guarding something important. Milesia found an observation point overlooking what appeared to be the facility's main laboratory complex. Through the reinforced viewing windows, she could see teams of goblin scientists working with equipment that defied easy description. Massive particle accelerators traced geometric patterns through the laboratory space, while containment fields held what appeared to be exotic matter in states that shouldn't have been possible. But at the center of the laboratory was something that made her blood run cold. Suspended in a complex web of force fields and monitoring equipment was a human figure, one of the missing colonists, connected to the alien machinery by neural interface cables and apparently unconscious. The implications hit her like a physical blow. The goblins weren't just mining trilithium, they were using human neural patterns to refine their synthesis process. The colonist was being used as a biological computer, his consciousness enslaved to optimize alien technology. Through the neural interface, she caught fragments of the scientist's communications. Satisfaction at breakthrough results. Anticipation of scaling up the process. And beneath it all, a cold indifference to the human cost of their research. Milesia forced herself to continue documenting the facility's operations, but the image of the enslaved colonist burned in her mind. This was no longer just about preventing the goblins from gaining access to trilithium synthesis. It was about stopping them from turning the entire human population of Kepler 442c into biological components for their war machine. She moved deeper into the laboratory complex, using service corridors and maintenance shafts to avoid the security patrols. The facility's design was becoming clearer now, a massive research installation built around the captured trilithium synthesis technology, with the computational power provided by enslaved human minds. In the facility's deepest level, she found what she was looking for, the primary synthesis chamber. It was a vast space filled with machinery that seemed to bend space and time around itself, creating local distortions in reality that hurt to look at directly. Streams of exotic particles flowed through transparent conduits, while monitoring systems tracked energy states that existed at the boundary between science and magic. And overseeing it all was War Chief Scar himself, a massive figure more machine than flesh, his cybernetic implants interfacing directly with the facility's control systems. Through the neural interface, she could sense his thoughts, cold calculation mixed with savage satisfaction at the success of his operation. Malaysia recorded everything she could, documenting the synthesis process and the facility's defensive systems. But as she prepared to begin her withdrawal, alarms began sounding throughout the complex. Emergency lighting bathed the corridors in harsh red illumination, and the neural chatter she was intercepting suddenly shifted to combat coordination. They had found the breach in the thermal exhaust vent. The facility was now on full alert, and she was trapped in the deepest level of a hostile installation with an unknown number of enemy troops between her and freedom. The mission had just become a survival exercise. As blast doors began sealing throughout the complex and search teams deployed to hunt for the intruder, Malaysia checked her chronometer. She still had 36 hours to reach the extraction point, but first she had to escape from what was rapidly becoming an impregnable fortress. The easy part of the mission was over. Now came the real challenge, getting out alive with the intelligence that might save the Empire. The emergency lockdown transformed the facility from a research installation into a fortress. Blast doors sealed every major intersection, automated defense systems came online, and search teams of heavily armed goblins began methodically sweeping every corridor and chamber. Through her neural interface, Malaysia could sense the coordinated hunt, dozens of alien minds working in perfect synchronization to trap and eliminate the intruder. She pressed herself deeper into the maintenance shaft where she had taken refuge, trying to plan an escape route that didn't involve direct confrontation with superior numbers. The facility's emergency protocols were thorough but not perfect. They were designed to contain a saboteur or prevent the theft of equipment, not to stop someone who simply wanted to leave. The key was finding a weakness in the lockdown procedures, some system that the Goblins had overlooked in their rush to secure the facility. Through the metal bulkheads, she could hear the sound of search teams moving through the laboratory levels. Their equipment was sophisticated: motion detectors, thermal scanners, and what sounded like some kind of electromagnetic resonance device that could probably detect her stealth suit's power signature if she got too close. But the Goblins had made one critical mistake. They assumed the intruder was still trying to gather intelligence. Their search pattern was focused on the facility's critical areas: the synthesis chamber, the computer centers, the command and control sections. They weren't paying as much attention to the facility's support systems. Malaysia consulted her mental map of the facility's layout, looking for systems that would be essential to the installation's operation but not critical enough to warrant heavy security. Every major facility had them: waste processing, atmospheric recycling, power distribution, water treatment. Mundane systems that kept the installation running but were rarely considered as potential escape routes. She found what she was looking for in the facility's power distribution network. The main power plant was located in a separate structure connected to the research facility by heavily shielded conduits that carried massive amounts of electrical energy. The conduits themselves would be too dangerous to traverse, but their maintenance tunnels might provide a route to the outside. Moving through the maintenance shafts required extreme care. Every few meters, she encountered sensor nodes that swept the tunnels with detection beams. Her stealth suit could deflect most forms of active scanning, but the Goblin technology operated on principles she didn't fully understand. She moved in short bursts, timing her movements to the gaps between sensor sweeps. The maintenance tunnels gradually led her away from the main facility toward the power plant. The tunnels here were older and less sophisticated, apparently part of the original colonial infrastructure that the Goblins had adapted rather than replaced. That was promising. Imperial engineering was familiar territory, even when modified by alien technology. She reached an intersection where the tunnel branched toward what her map indicated was the main power plant. But as she prepared to continue, Her neural interface suddenly exploded with alarm signals. The search teams had found her route. Through the alien chatter, she caught fragments of tactical coordination. The Goblins had analyzed the thermal signatures in the facility's ventilation system and backtracked her route to the maintenance tunnels. Search teams were now moving to block all possible exit routes. Malaysia had perhaps 10 minutes before the tunnels would be flooded with enemy troops. She needed to reach the power plant and find another way out before the net closed around her. She abandoned stealth for speed, crawling through the tunnel system as quickly as the confined space would allow. Behind her, she could hear the sound of Goblin troops entering the maintenance network, the whir of cutting tools as they opened access hatches, the mechanical chatter of their communication devices, the heavy footfalls of boots on metal decking. The tunnel opened into a larger service area beneath the power plant. The space was filled with massive electrical conduits and transformer equipment that hummed with barely contained energy. Warning signs in multiple languages covered every surface, and the air itself seemed to crackle with electromagnetic discharge. Through her neural interface, she could sense the Goblin search teams getting closer. Their emotional state had shifted from methodical hunting to excited anticipation. They believed they had their quarry trapped. Malaysia studied the power plant's layout, looking for an escape route that wouldn't involve electrocution or a direct confrontation with enemy forces. The plant's main reactor was a massive fusion installation that had clearly been upgraded with Goblin technology. But the basic Imperial design was still recognizable, which meant she understood its vulnerabilities. Every fusion reactor had emergency venting systems designed to release excess plasma in case of containment failure. The vents led directly to the outside through heavily shielded conduits that could survive a reactor meltdown. They would also be hot enough to kill anyone foolish enough to use them as an escape route. Unless someone had a stealth suit with thermal protection systems and a very high tolerance for danger. The reactor control room was guarded by automated defense systems, but they were designed to prevent unauthorized access to the reactor itself, not to stop someone from manipulating the emergency systems. Malaysia bypassed the security protocols using techniques learned during her engineering cross-training and began the delicate process of triggering a controlled emergency vent. The reactor's control systems resisted her efforts. Multiple fail-safes and automated overrides tried to prevent what they interpreted as sabotage. But she wasn't trying to destroy the reactor, merely convince it that a minor containment fluctuation required emergency venting. Through the neural interface, she could sense the search teams getting closer. They had found her trail in the maintenance tunnels and were following it to the power plant. She had perhaps 5 minutes before they reached her position. The reactor finally accepted her commands and began the emergency venting sequence. Klaxons sounded throughout the power plant as superheated plasma began flowing through the emergency conduits toward the external venting system. The temperature in the control room spiked dramatically as the reactor prepared to release its excess energy. Malaysia sealed her suit's environmental systems and made her way to the emergency vent access point. The conduit beyond was a cylindrical tunnel filled with superheated gas and electromagnetic radiation that would have been instantly fatal to an unprotected human. Her suit's thermal protection systems immediately began protesting the extreme conditions, warning lights flashing as the environmental controls struggled to keep her alive. She had perhaps 60 seconds before her suit's systems failed, and she became another casualty of the Goblin occupation. The journey through the emergency vent was a nightmare of heat, radiation, and barely controlled panic. The tunnel twisted and turned as it led away from the reactor core, its walls glowing white-hot from the plasma flow. Malaysia's suit registered temperatures that should have been impossible to survive, and she could feel the thermal protection systems beginning to fail. But the tunnel led where she needed it to, directly to the outside of the power plant complex. The external vent was a massive opening in the side of the installation, designed to safely disperse reactor plasma into the atmosphere. As she tumbled out of the vent and rolled down the facility's sloped hull, she could feel her suit's systems beginning to recover from the thermal overload. Behind her, the power plant's emergency venting system continued its programmed cycle, masking her escape with clouds of superheated gas that would confuse any thermal sensors. The Goblin search teams would eventually realize what had happened, but by then she would be long gone. Malaysia activated her suit's full camouflage system and disappeared into the industrial landscape surrounding the facility complex. She had the intelligence Admiral Zhao needed, detailed information about the trilithium synthesis operation and the horrific means the Goblins were using to accomplish their goals. Now she just had to survive long enough to deliver it. The extraction point was still nearly 100 kilometers away, and the Goblins would soon realize that their intruder had escaped. They would flood the surrounding area with search teams, and every patrol would be looking for signs of Imperial infiltration. The real hunt was just beginning. The industrial complex surrounding the power plant provided temporary concealment, but Malaysia knew she couldn't remain in the area. Within minutes, the Goblins would expand their search perimeter to include the entire facility compound, and her stealth suit's power reserves were running dangerously low after the ordeal in the reactor's emergency vent. She made her way through the maze of processing equipment and storage tanks, using the facility's own infrastructure to mask her movement from aerial surveillance. The Goblin occupation had transformed the landscape into an alien industrial nightmare, but the basic principles of concealment remained the same: stay low, move carefully, and use every available bit of cover. Through her neural interface, she could monitor the expanding search operation. The Goblins were being methodical and thorough, deploying not just ground search teams but aerial patrols and what appeared to be sophisticated sensor drones. Their emotional state had shifted from the excitement of the hunt to grim determination. They understood that the intruder possessed information that could compromise their entire operation. As she reached the edge of the industrial complex, Malaysia paused to assess her situation. The extraction point was 96 kilometers away through terrain that was now crawling with enemy forces. Her stealth suit's power reserves were at 60% and dropping steadily. Worse, the neural interface headset was beginning to show signs of straying from prolonged exposure to Goblin communications. The constant alien chatter was giving her a severe headache and making it difficult to concentrate. But she had the intelligence that could save the Empire. The trilithium synthesis facility was real, it was operational, and it was using enslaved human minds to optimize its production processes. The Goblins weren't just stealing Imperial technology, they were perverting it into something monstrous. The route to the extraction point led through the Harmon Valley's northern reaches, an area that had been heavily mined and now resembled a lunar landscape of craters and excavated earth. The terrain would provide little natural concealment, but the environmental damage from the mining operations might interfere with Goblin sensors. Malaysia activated her suit's long-range navigation system and began the dangerous journey toward freedom. The first few kilometers passed without incident as she moved through the mining-scarred landscape, using the excavated craters and abandoned equipment as cover. But as she crested a ridge overlooking the valley's northern approach, she encountered a sight that made her blood freeze. Goblin forces were already moving to block the extraction point. Through her enhanced optics, she could see a convoy of military vehicles deploying along the mountain road that led to the rendezvous coordinates. The aliens had anticipated her escape route, and were moving to cut off her only way home. Either they had broken Imperial codes, or their strategic thinking was more sophisticated than anyone had realized. The neural interface confirmed her worst fears. The Goblin communications were focused on establishing a perimeter around what they clearly identified as the most likely extraction zone. They knew exactly where she was going and were prepared to stop her from getting there. Malaysia consulted her tactical map, looking for alternative routes that might avoid the Goblin blockade. The extraction point was located in a mountain valley specifically chosen for its defensible terrain and limited approach routes. There were other ways to reach the valley, but they all involved crossing exposed terrain under the observation of Goblin aerial patrols. As she considered her options, her suit's proximity sensors detected movement in the crater field behind her. The search teams had expanded their perimeter, and were now sweeping through the mining area in coordinated waves. She was being squeezed between the advancing search teams and the blocking force at the extraction point. The situation called for desperate measures. Malaysia activated Jack's emergency transponder, knowing that using it would reveal her position to any Goblin forces monitoring Imperial communication frequencies. But if Admiral Zhao's fleet was listening, they might be able to provide some kind of assistance, a distraction, a feint, anything that might give her a chance to reach the extraction point. The quantum entanglement effect was instantaneous but brief, just long enough to transmit her position and situation to the fleet's monitoring stations. Whether anyone would receive the signal, or be able to act on it, was beyond her control. She resumed her movement toward the extraction point, abandoning stealth for speed. If the goblins knew where she was going anyway, her only chance was to reach the rendezvous before they could complete their encirclement. The terrain gradually changed from mining-scarred wasteland to the foothills of the mountain range where the extraction point was located. The landscape here showed less damage from the goblin occupation. Apparently the trilithium deposits were concentrated in the valley floor, leaving the higher elevations relatively untouched. But the mountains also provided perfect positions for the goblin blocking force. As Malaysia approached the final approach to the extraction valley, she could see weapon emplacements and observation posts positioned on the commanding heights. The aliens had turned her rendezvous point into a killing field. Through the neural interface, she could sense the goblin forces settling into their ambush positions. Their emotional state was confident and patient. They believed they had won, that the Imperial intruder was walking into a trap from which there could be no escape. They were probably right. Malaysia found concealment in a rocky outcropping approximately 5 kilometers from the extraction point, and tried to develop a plan that didn't involve suicidal heroics. The goblin positions were well chosen and professionally established. Any direct approach would be detected long before she could reach the landing zone. But as she studied the enemy positions through her enhanced optics, she noticed something that might represent an opportunity. The goblin forces were deployed to stop someone approaching the extraction point from the outside. They hadn't anticipated the possibility of someone already being inside their perimeter. The extraction valley was a narrow defile between two mountain peaks, chosen because it provided natural protection from aerial attack and limited the approaches that enemy forces could use to interfere with the pickup. But the same features that made it defensible also made it predictable. If she could get above the valley, she might be able to approach the extraction point from an angle the goblins hadn't anticipated. The climb up the eastern mountain face was treacherous and exhausting. The rock was loose and unstable, made worse by the lower gravity that made it difficult to judge distances and momentum. Her stealth suit's gecko grip system helped, but the technology was never designed for extended mountaineering. As she climbed higher, the goblin positions below became more visible. The aliens had deployed significant forces, at least a full company of troops with heavy weapons and air support. They were taking no chances with the Imperial intruder. But they were also focused on the valley floor and the obvious approach routes. Their surveillance was concentrated downward and outward, not upward toward the mountain peaks above their positions. Malaysia reached the summit of the eastern peak just as the extraction window opened. According to her chronometer, the Imperial pickup shuttle would arrive in exactly 12 minutes, if it arrived at all. The goblin forces might have made the extraction too dangerous to attempt. From her position high above the valley, she could see the entire tactical situation laid out below. The goblin forces were perfectly positioned to intercept any aircraft attempting to land in the designated zone. But they were also exposed to attack from above, if someone had the right weapons and sufficient courage. She didn't have the right weapons. But she did have Jack's emergency transponder, a stealth suit with limited offensive capabilities, and a desperate plan that might just work. The plan was simple in concept and probably fatal in execution. If she could create enough confusion and distraction in the goblin positions, the extraction shuttle might be able to get in and out before the enemy could react effectively. The key was timing. She would have to initiate her attack at the exact moment the shuttle arrived, giving the pilot the maximum chance of success. Malaysia checked her suit's weapon systems. A single-pulse rifle with limited ammunition and some basic explosive charges intended for emergency situations. Not much against a company of heavily armed goblin troops, but perhaps enough to cause the confusion she needed. Through the neural interface, she could sense the alien forces growing restless as the extraction window approached. They knew the Imperial shuttle was coming, and they were ready. In the distance, a new star appeared in the alien sky, the heat signature of a spacecraft entering the atmosphere at high speed. The extraction shuttle was coming in fast and low, trying to minimize its exposure to goblin weapons. It was time to find out if desperate courage could overcome superior numbers and firepower. Malaysia began her descent toward the goblin positions, moving as quickly as the treacherous terrain would allow. In less than 10 minutes, she would discover if her mission would end in success or disaster. The fate of the Empire hung in the balance of the next few minutes. The Imperial extraction shuttle Quicksilver came in like a falling star, its hull glowing from atmospheric friction as it plunged toward the designated landing zone. Pilot Commander Sarah Kim, one of the fleet's best, was pushing the craft far beyond its normal performance parameters, trading safety for speed in a desperate attempt to reach the extraction point before the Goblin forces could react. From her position halfway down the mountain face, Malaysia could see the alien troops scrambling to respond to the unexpected arrival. The shuttle's approach vector was different from what they had anticipated, steeper and faster than standard Imperial procedures called for. The Goblin weapons crews were struggling to track a target that was moving too quickly and unpredictably for their firing solutions. But they would adapt quickly. Within minutes, they would have the shuttle bracketed with weapons fire, turning the extraction into a death trap for both the pilot and her passenger. Malaysia reached the edge of the Goblin perimeter just as the shuttle began its final approach. Through her neural interface, she could sense the alien communications shifting from confident anticipation to urgent tactical coordination. Orders were being transmitted, weapons were being repositioned, and the trap was beginning to close. She activated her pulse rifle and targeted the nearest Goblin weapon emplacement, a heavy plasma cannon positioned to cover the landing zone's northern approach. The weapons crew was focused on the approaching shuttle, their attention divided between tracking the target and preparing their firing solution. Her first shot took the gunner in the center of mass, the pulse rifle's energy discharge overloading his cybernetic systems and dropping him instantly. The second shot destroyed the weapon's control console in a shower of sparks and molten metal. But the attack also revealed her position to every Goblin force in the valley. Suddenly, she was the center of attention for an entire company of hostile aliens. Plasma bolts and projectile rounds filled the air around her position as the Goblin troops tried to locate and eliminate the threat to their ambush. Malaysia rolled behind a boulder as the mountain face around her erupted in explosions and energy discharges. Her stealth suit's camouflage system was useless now. Every Goblin in the valley knew exactly where she was. But the distraction was working. The shuttle's pilot was taking advantage of the confusion to make her final approach, bringing the craft down in a controlled crash landing that sent up clouds of dust and debris. Through the neural interface, Malaysia could sense the Goblin forces trying to split their attention between the new threat on the mountainside and the primary target in the landing zone. She emerged from cover long enough to place an explosive charge on another weapon emplacement, then dove for new shelter as return fire concentrated on her position. The charge detonated 3 seconds later, taking out a communications array and the troops manning it. 2 weapons down, but at least a dozen more still operational. And the Goblin forces were beginning to coordinate their response, with some troops moving to engage her while others maintained their focus on the extraction zone. Through her enhanced optics, she could see the shuttle's landing ramp beginning to lower. Pilot Commander Kim was keeping the engine spooled up, ready for immediate departure once her passenger was aboard. But the landing zone was still under fire from multiple Goblin positions, making any approach extremely dangerous. Malaysia made the decision that would define the rest of her life, or end it in the next few seconds. Instead of trying to reach the shuttle through the Goblin crossfire, she would give Commander Kim the clear shot she needed. She activated the last of her explosive charges and began a desperate charge down the mountainside directly into the center of the Goblin positions. The aliens' defensive formation was designed to stop someone approaching the landing zone from outside the valley, not to repel an attack from within their own perimeter. Her pulse rifle spat energy bolts as she moved, targeting communications equipment, weapon batteries, and command posts with methodical precision. She wasn't trying to eliminate the entire Goblin force, that would have been impossible. But she could create enough chaos and confusion to disrupt their coordination and give the shuttle a chance to escape. A plasma bolt grazed her left shoulder, overloading her suit's protective systems and sending numbing shock through her arm. She stumbled but kept moving, using her momentum to carry her through the goblin line toward the landing zone. The aliens were good, professional soldiers with excellent equipment and training. But they had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated the determination of a single Imperial officer with nothing left to lose. She reached the edge of the landing zone just as the shuttle's pilot began to lift off. The craft was taking fire from multiple directions, its shields sparking as energy bolts struck the hull. But Commander Kim was managing to keep the shuttle stable long enough for her passenger to reach safety. Malaysia sprinted across the open ground of the landing zone, her stealth suit's remaining power reserves channeled into the leg servos for maximum speed. Plasma bolts and projectile rounds tracked her movement, but the combination of her enhanced reflexes and the goblin's divided attention kept her just ahead of the incoming fire. The shuttle's ramp was still open, hovering 3 meters above the ground as the pilot fought to maintain control under enemy fire. Malaysia gathered herself and leaped, her enhanced muscles launching her upward just as a goblin rocket struck the ground where she had been standing. Strong hands grabbed her arms and hauled her into the shuttle's cargo bay. As the ramp sealed and the craft accelerated away from the landing zone, she found herself looking into the concerned face of Pilot Commander Kim. "Welcome aboard, Captain," Kim said over the sound of weapons fire striking the shuttle's hull. "I hope you got what we came for, because that was the most expensive pickup in fleet history." Through the shuttle's viewports, Malaysia could see the Goblin forces reorganizing for pursuit. Several aircraft were already lifting off from concealed positions around the valley, and she could see the energy signatures of surface-to-air missile batteries powering up. But the Quicksilver was designed for exactly this kind of emergency extraction. Commander Kim pushed the craft through a series of evasive maneuvers that would have been impossible for a larger vessel, using the mountain terrain to break missile locks and avoid the worst of the enemy fire. "Fleet Command is going to want a full debrief as soon as we reach the ship," Kim said as the shuttle cleared the atmosphere and began its journey back to the Imperial fleet. "Admiral Zhao has been pacing the bridge like a caged animal since you missed your first check-in." Malaysia nodded, already organizing her thoughts for the intelligence briefing that would determine the Empire's response to the Goblin threat. She had the information Admiral Zhao needed: detailed technical specifications of the trilithium synthesis facility, confirmation of the Goblin's strategic objectives, and evidence of the atrocities being committed against the colonial population. But she also carried the memory of the enslaved colonist connected to the alien machinery, his consciousness trapped in service to the enemy's war machine. That image would haunt her for the rest of her life, a reminder of what was at stake in the conflict between the Empire and the Goblin hegemony. The shuttle docked with the ISV Constellation exactly 4 hours after the extraction, welcomed by the controlled chaos of a warship preparing for battle. Admiral Zhao was waiting in the docking bay, his expression a mixture of relief and grim anticipation. "Captain Thorne," he said as she disembarked from the shuttle, "I trust your vacation was educational." "Very, sir. The Goblins have been busy. Briefing room in 10 minutes. Director Cross is monitoring via quantum link from Fleet Command, and the other task force commanders are standing by. This intelligence could change everything." As Malaysia made her way to the briefing room, she felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. In a few minutes, she would present information that might determine whether the Empire survived the next decade intact or fell to an alien invasion that showed no mercy to the conquered. The easy part of the mission was over. Now came the hardest challenge of all, convincing the Imperial leadership to act on what she had learned before it was too late. The holographic displays in the briefing room showed the tactical situation across the entire Kepler system, Goblin positions, Imperial fleet deployments, and the civilian population still trapped on the occupied worlds. As she took her place at the head of the conference table, Malaysia realized that her mission had been just the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous conflict. The future of human civilization might depend on what happened in the next few hours. 6 months later. The liberation of Kepler 442c had taken 3 weeks of brutal fighting and cost the Imperial Navy 2 heavy cruisers, 6 destroyers, and nearly 15,000 lives. But as Captain Malaysia Thorne stood in the ruins of the Goblin trilithium synthesis facility, she knew the price had been worth paying. The facility was a shattered husk of its former self, its towers broken and its laboratories gutted by precise orbital bombardment. But the most important victory wasn't the destruction of the alien installation. It was the liberation of the 300 human colonists who had been connected to the synthesis machinery. Most of them would recover. The Goblin neural interface technology was crude but reversible, and Imperial medical teams had been working around the clock to restore the damaged minds of the former prisoners. Some would never be the same, but they were alive and free. "The final casualty reports are in," Admiral Zhao said, joining her at the observation point overlooking the destroyed facility. "Total civilian casualties from the occupation, approximately 1.8 million. We were able to save about 200,000. Malaysia nodded, feeling the familiar weight of command decisions and their consequences. The Empire had won a strategic victory, preventing the Goblins from gaining access to unlimited trilithium production, but the human cost had been enormous. "The intelligence you gathered made the difference," Zhao continued. "Without knowing the facility's exact location and defensive layout, we would have had to glass the entire valley from orbit. Your mission saved whatever civilian population we were able to recover." "And the Goblin hegemony?" "Pulling back to the Rim territories, at least for now. The loss of their synthesis facility was a major setback to their expansion plans. Intelligence estimates they'll need at least 5 years to rebuild their strategic capabilities." 5 years. Time enough for the Empire to strengthen its defenses and prepare for the next confrontation. But Malaysia knew the conflict was far from over. It had simply moved to a different phase. "I have new orders for you," Admiral Zhao said, producing a sealed communication pad. "Fleet Command is establishing a new intelligence division focused specifically on the Goblin threat. They want someone with experience behind enemy lines to lead the operation." Malaysia accepted the orders but didn't immediately break the seal. "And if I decline? Then someone else will take the job, and they'll probably make mistakes that get people killed. The Empire needs officers who understand what we're really fighting against." Through the broken windows of the facility's command center, she could see Imperial engineering teams beginning the process of dismantling the remaining Goblin technology. Every piece of equipment would be studied, analyzed, and catalogued in the hope of understanding the enemy's capabilities and limitations. But Malaysia knew that the real threat wasn't Goblin technology, it was Goblin philosophy. They saw other species as resources to be exploited, obstacles to be eliminated, or tools to be used. The Empire's fundamental belief in the dignity and value of all sentient life was incompatible with the alien mindset. That philosophical conflict would define the struggle for the next century or more. "I'll take the assignment," she said finally. "But I want Jack Harrison as my chief technical officer. And I want full authority to recruit personnel from across the fleet." "Done. Your new command ship is being fitted out at the Tau Ceti shipyards. The ISV Intrepid, a modified exploration vessel equipped with the latest stealth and reconnaissance systems." As they left the ruined facility, Malaysia took one last look at the devastated landscape of Kepler 442c. In time, the world would recover. The colonists would rebuild their cities, replant their forests, and resume the quiet work of civilization that made the Empire worth defending. But she would remember the price of that recovery: the millions who had died, the hundreds who had been enslaved, and the terrible cost of underestimating an enemy that viewed mercy as weakness. The Goblin hegemony had been stopped, but not defeated. They would be back, stronger and more determined than before. And when they returned, the Empire would be ready. Malaysia activated her communicator and began composing her first message to the new Intelligence Division's personnel office. There was work to do, and very little time to do it. The next war was already beginning.